I still remember the exact second my life split into before and after. It was 21:45, about 9:45 at night, and I was standing in front of table 14 at Skyline 41 with a folded receipt in my hand, pretending it was just a bill and not a warning that could get me and my little brother killed. My fingers were shaking so hard the ink had bled a little, which felt about right, because everything about that night was already starting to blur at the edges. If you have ever worked in a fancy restaurant, you know the feeling. The lights are soft and flattering, the music is low and expensive, and none of it belongs to you. You just move through it, invisible, refilling water glasses for people who never bother to look up long enough to learn your name. That was my life. My name is Lily Hart, and at the time, I was just a tired waitress trying to keep the rent paid on a one-bedroom walk-up and make sure my 13-year-old brother, Noah, we didn't notice how close we were to drowning. I wasn't brave. I wasn't special. I was just the girl who stayed late to cover extra tables because the power company doesn't care how many double shifts you already worked that week. But that night, the city outside the glass walls of Skyline 41 glittered like it was showing off. And table 14 belonged to the man everyone in Chicago whispered about without ever saying his name out loud. You know the type of man I mean, the one people call connected with a certain tone, the one whose business card no one ever seems to have, but whose shadow stretches over whole neighborhoods. In our case, his name was Adrian Cole, and when he first started coming in, the managers pretended he was just another rich guy with a taste for dry-aged steak and skyline views. By the time that night rolled around, we all knew better. You didn't talk about him at the front host stand. Not if you were smart. You just made sure his table was spotless, his drink never hit empty, and you never, ever stared for too long. And yet there I was, staring. Not at him exactly, more at the space next to his crystal tumbler where my folded receipt was about to land. It looked harmless, like any other piece of paper that passed between servers and guests 100 times a night. But I knew what was written inside, and my pulse was beating so loud in my ears, I almost couldn't hear the restaurant anymore. I didn't start the night planning to save a Mafia boss. I started the night like any other Friday, clocking in early at 17:05 in the afternoon, because my manager had texted to say we were overbooked and understaffed, and he'd make it worth my while. Spoiler alert, it never is, but I went anyway, because Noah needed new sneakers and the landlord had just slipped a red notice under our door. By 21:25, my feet were already numb in my black non-slip shoes, and I had lipstick smudged on my wrist from where I'd tried to fix a rushed makeup job in the staff bathroom mirror. I remember ducking into the ladies' room on my 5-minute break, telling myself I had exactly long enough to pee, scroll through 2 messages on my phone, and breathe twice before I had to slap on a smile and go back out there. It was quiet, the way fancy bathrooms always are, all marble and chrome and the faint scent of something that probably cost more than my entire makeup bag. I took the last stall, locked the door, and sat down like my bones were 80 years old instead of 23. That was my little ritual, my tiny rebellion, scrolling through cheap memes while rich people complained about the temperature of their wine. For about 30 seconds, life was simple. Me, my phone, my exhaustion, the soft whoosh of the air vents. Then the door swung open, and the sound of heels hit the marble like gunshots, not the wobbly, cheap kind I wore when I tried to feel grown up, but sharp, confident clicks that said whoever this was had never in her life worried about rent. A sharp, expensive perfume cut through the faint floral scent of the bathroom like it owned the place. I went very still. It is funny, the way your body remembers old habits, even when you don't realize you have them. Growing up where we did, you learn early that sometimes the safest thing you can do is become silent and small. So I lifted my feet off the floor and held my breath without even thinking. She started talking before I even heard the stall door close. At first it sounded like the usual stuff, that bored, rich girl tone I'd heard a million times on dates and business dinners at Skyline 41, the sound of someone who has never had to scrub anything for a living. But then a sentence cut through the humming in my ears, clear enough to make my skin go cold. She mentioned the window table. There was only one window table that mattered that night, the one at the far corner of the restaurant, pressed against the glass so you could look straight out over the river and the city lights, the one where Adrian Cole was sitting. She talked about angles and timing, about how he had finally settled, how they were already in position. I remember that part vividly, because even though she never used the words hit or kill, my brain filled them in without hesitation. She spoke like she was confirming an order, calm and precise, like this was just another appointment. My hand froze around my phone. Every noise in that bathroom seemed to echo. The rush of water from the tap, the rustle of fabric, the familiar small sounds of someone fixing their makeup before going back to play their part in the dining room. But under it all was this other thing, this ice-cold line of understanding that slid right down my spine. She mentioned a man at the bar and 3 near the kitchen. Those details stuck, like someone had written them on the inside of my eyelids. 1 at the bar, 3 near the kitchen entrance, a clean view of the glass. I remember thinking, there must be some other explanation. Maybe it was an overdramatic way to talk about a surprise party or a flash mob, something stupid and harmless. But people who are planning a flash mob do not switch languages halfway through a sentence and drop their voice so low you can barely hear it. That is what she did next. Midway through an instruction, her words slid into another language, something harsh and sharp around the edges, consonants like broken glass. I didn't understand a single word, but I didn't need to. The tone said enough. She washed her hands while she talked, the tap running for just long enough to blur a few syllables. I listened so hard my head hurt, wanting to piece every fragment together, terrified that any movement I made would give me away. Every instinct in me screamed to stay hidden, let it go, pretend I had heard nothing. The bathroom door opened again, and the heels clicked away down the hallway. I stayed in that stall for a full 30 seconds after the silence settled, counting my breaths, waiting for the sound of the outer door opening and closing again. Only when I was absolutely sure she was gone did I unlock the stall and step out. My reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. Wide eyes, too much eyeliner, hair pulled back in a rushed ponytail, black uniform that never quite fit right. I looked like any other service worker in a high-end restaurant, someone you could miss 100 times in a night without noticing. Inside, I felt like I had swallowed a live wire. Those phrases kept looping in my head. The window table, the man at the bar, the 3 near the kitchen, and behind them a new, ugly awareness. Whatever was about to happen out there, it was not random. I splashed water on my face, more to wake myself up than anything else. I tried to tell myself this was not my business, that if I stepped in, I would be putting Noah at risk too, because danger never stays neatly in the place where it starts. I pictured him at home, probably in front of the old TV, hoodie half-zipped, complaining about homework and pretending he wasn't worried about me walking home after close. I could have walked back out there, kept my mouth shut, kept my head down. God knows that is what most people in my position would have done, what survival in our neighborhood trains you to do. Look away, pretend you did not see, let powerful people solve their own problems. But there was something about the way she had said it, about the quiet, casual betrayal in her voice, that snapped something in me. Maybe it was the thought of some stranger's brains painting that beautiful restaurant window while everybody pretended it was just another freak crime on the news. Maybe it was the way she spoke about him like he was a problem to be erased, not a person. I wish I could tell you I made some clear, noble decision right then. The truth is messier. It felt less like choosing and more like being dragged by my own conscience toward a line I had spent years carefully never crossing. By the time I pushed the bathroom door open, my 5 minutes were definitely up. The hum of the dining room hit me like a wave, clinking glasses, low laughter, a distant cheer from the bar where some table had just ordered a round of tequila shots. Skyline 41 looked exactly the same as it had 15 minutes earlier, but to me it felt like walking into a room where a bomb had already been armed. I scanned the bar and saw him immediately. A man nursing 1 drink longer than any normal person would, gaze drifting not to the TV above the shelves but to the reflections in the glass. Near the kitchen entrance, 3 men who looked like they had been copy-pasted from every vague memory I had of trouble growing up, the wrong kind of relaxed. Chairs angled for a clear view of the room. It fit too perfectly, the way puzzle pieces lock together once you finally see the picture. My section was busy, but my hands went on autopilot. Take order, Drop checks, smile, apologize, refill water, all while my brain screamed over and over, "Do something, do something, do something." Every time I passed table 14 and saw the back of his broad shoulders, the cut of his suit, the way his security blended into the background, my heart tried to claw its way up my throat. Somewhere between dropping entrees at table 9 and resetting the silverware at 12, I realized I had stopped arguing with myself. The receipt book felt heavy in my apron pocket, the pen even heavier in my hand. I slid behind the service station, opened one blank slip, and wrote the ugliest, most important sentence of my life. It was short, blunt, and no time for politeness. Window table. Girlfriend sold you out. 1 at the bar, 3 near the kitchen, shooter watching from across the river. My handwriting looked strange to me, tighter than usual, as if my own hand did not quite want to admit what it was saying. When I folded the slip and tucked it under the real check for table 14, my whole body buzzed with adrenaline. I knew once I put that paper down, there was no rewinding, no taking it back, and going back to being invisible. That little square of cheap stock might as well have been a flare fired into the dark. So when you ask me why I did it, why a nobody waitress chose to risk everything for a man like Adrian Cole, this is the only answer I have. Because I couldn't walk past that table and pretend I didn't know what was coming. Because sometimes the thing that keeps you alive for years, that habit of keeping your head down, suddenly feels more dangerous than the risk of finally looking up. From the service station to table 14 is maybe 15 steps. That night, it felt like crossing a minefield. I could feel the folded receipt in my hand like it was hot, like it might burn straight through my skin if I held it for too long. Skyline 41 was humming in that way only a Friday night can. Glasses catching the light, forks scraping against plates, a low swell of laughter, and deals and dates happening under dim bulbs and too loud music from the lounge downstairs. Nobody knew that somewhere between the bar and the kitchen, I was walking around with a warning that should have belonged in a crime movie, not on a flimsy piece of paper in a waitress's grip. Table 14 sat pressed right up against the glass. If you leaned back in that seat, you could pretend you were floating above the river, with the city spread out below like a map of all the futures you could never afford. I had wiped that table down 100 times, refolded its napkins, replaced its candles. But that night, it might as well have been an altar. Adrian Cole was exactly where he always sat, back to the window, facing the room. It was one of those little details you do not really notice until you start paying attention, the way powerful men never like having their backs exposed. He wore a dark suit that fit a little too well to be off the rack, and a silver watch that flashed at his wrist when he lifted his glass. Across from him, Sloane Parker might as well have been in a perfume ad. Perfect hair, perfect dress, that sort of laugh that is engineered to tinkle at just the right pitch. If I had not spent the last 10 minutes hiding in a bathroom stall listening to her set up his death, I might have thought they looked good together. I approached their table the way training videos say you should, with shoulders relaxed, a neutral smile, and attention split between the guests and the plates. On the outside, I was just the server checking in after the main course. On the inside, every nerve in my body was screaming. I slid the real bill into the little black folder, and then, as casually as I could, set the folded slip beside his glass on the pristine white linen. From a distance, it looked like I had simply laid down a receipt that had been signed, the sort of thing that happens every 2 minutes in a place like ours. Up close, I knew it was a tiny, handwritten explosion. My throat felt dry. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, which is ridiculous, because the restaurant noise should have been louder. The room seemed to pull back for a second, as if everything had tilted around this one stupid, brave, reckless act. I remember focusing on my own voice, on keeping it level, on saying whatever I usually said at this point in the meal. Something about dessert, coffee, and how everything was tasting. I did not care about any of that. I just needed to stall long enough for him to notice the paper. He did not look at me at first. He listened in that half-distracted way people like him always did, nodding at the right beats, hand resting near his glass, eyes traveling across the room like he was counting exits. For a moment, I thought maybe this had been pointless, that the note would get swept away with the plates, never opened, and I would have risked everything for nothing. Then his attention dipped. His fingers brushed the folded slip, almost like it was an accident, the way you might straighten something out of place on a table. He lifted it with 2 fingers and turned it over. I swear the whole restaurant disappeared right then. Someone laughed loudly at a corner table. A busser dropped a fork near the kitchen. The bartender yelled something about last call for some promo cocktail, but all I could see was his eyes scanning my cramped handwriting. His face did not change, not in any obvious way. If you had walked past in that moment, you would have thought he was checking the total, maybe reading some little thank you note from a staff member who hoped for a bigger tip. But I had spent months reading people's moods off tiny shifts in expression, because that was how you survived in a place where a bad night could mean no rent. I saw the way his jaw tightened, just slightly, the way one muscle in his cheek flickered and then went still. He did not whip his head toward the window. He did not leap to his feet or shout or send the table flying the way they always do in movies. Instead, his gaze came up, slow and deliberate, and found mine. Being looked at by him felt like stepping under a spotlight. Not the warm kind either. More like the cold, bright light they use in interrogation rooms on TV. I had seen him before, obviously, bringing plates to the table, clearing glasses, but he had never really looked back. In that second, all the things I knew about him, and all the things I had only heard, collided. Rumors about who he controlled, about shipments coming in at strange hours down at the docks, about club owners who suddenly started paying their debts on time, the way managers at Skyline 41 lowered their voices when his reservation came in and double-checked every single detail around his table. He studied me without hurrying. It felt like he was taking inventory, hair scraped back, cheap eyeliner, the faint shadows under my eyes from too many double shifts, the calluses on my fingers from holding trays. I had the wild thought that he could probably see right through to the grocery list in my head and the overdue bills sitting on our kitchen counter. For one insane moment, panic clawed up my throat, and I wanted to grab the slip back, pretend it had been a mistake, pretend I had not just thrown my entire life across his table. I imagined Noah's face if this all went wrong. Imagined some stranger in a suit standing at our apartment door, asking questions no 13-year-old should ever have to answer. My hands felt numb around the tray I was still holding, and then something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not fear, something colder and sharper, like a lock clicking into place. If I had to name it now, I would call it calculation. In that look, I realized he was not just reading the words on the paper. He was weighing me as a factor. What I had heard, what I had seen, how big a liability or asset I might be. I suddenly understood how dangerous I had made myself, just by knowing too much. Behind him, Sloane said something in that light, tinkling way she had, lifted her phone, laughed at whatever was on the screen. I remember the oddness of it, her complete lack of awareness that her whole plan had just been dragged out into the open. She sat there in her perfect dress, living in a reality where people were chess pieces, and she was the one moving them. Adrian's eyes did not leave mine. In my head, I could hear every warning I had ever been given about men like him. Do not get involved. Do not owe them anything. Do not let them owe you either, because either way, you are marked. He did something then that I did not expect. His expression did not soften, but his gaze steadied, like he had made a decision. In that stillness, I could feel the weight of the choice settling over both of us. Later, when I replayed that moment, I would remember tiny details. The condensation ring under his glass, the way the candle flame between us flickered as someone opened the main doors and let a draft in, the faint reflection of the restaurant in the dark window behind him, all those glittering people who thought they were safe. He placed the folded slip back down on the table, face down this time, almost casual. To anyone glancing over, it looked like just another piece of paper in a sea of plates and stemware, but I knew the message had landed. He said something then, something quiet and controlled, something that meant I was not supposed to leave. I will not pretend I remember the exact words, because what stayed with me was not the sentence itself, but the feeling. It was not a request, not really, more like the air around us had shifted, and now walking away was no longer an option. I could have ignored that. I could have smiled, made some excuse about other tables needing me, and stepped back into the safe, crowded chaos of the dining room, but my feet did not move. From the corner of my eye, I saw one of his security team members straighten up slightly near the edge of the room. I had clocked them when the host first set the table. Men who were dressed well enough to blend in, but whose eyes did not match their clothing. No drinks in front of them, no date, no real interest in the menu. Now, almost imperceptibly, they were in motion. One peeled off toward the bar, another shifted nearer the path to the kitchen, like pieces on a board sliding into defensive positions. Nobody else around us seemed to notice. They were too busy taking selfies with the city lights or arguing about desserts. I stood there with my tray held close to my chest, feeling like a prop that had accidentally wandered into the middle of a play it was never meant to be in. I knew if anyone looked too closely at my face, they would see it, the panic, and the "what have I done" written there. But no one did. Customers rarely do. There was a moment, just the briefest one, where time thinned out. Adrian sat calmly at his table, Sloane gleaming beside him, his men drifting into quiet formation. Me planted there like a tree that had grown in the wrong place. The city beyond the glass glittered. All those little lights living their own lives, unaware. And then the universe answered the question I had not quite dared to ask. A tiny flash of light flickered in the dark glass behind him, in exactly the spot my brain had been obsessing over since the bathroom. Not a reflection from inside, but a pinpoint glint from somewhere out in the night, high and fixed and wrong. It was the kind of glint you only see from metal under tension, from glass around a scope, from something pointed exactly where I was standing, exactly where he was sitting. In that heartbeat, with that tiny flash, I understood that the countdown had already hit 0, and the shot was coming. The flash in the window was so small I could have convinced myself I imagined it. A pinprick of light in the ocean of night outside, there and gone in less than a second. If I had not spent the last half hour obsessing over that exact spot, maybe my brain would have filed it under random reflections and moved on. Instead, my body reacted before the rest of me caught up. It was like something deep in my spine made the call, not my mind. One moment, I was standing beside the table, tray against my chest, knees locked. The next, my feet were leaving the ground. I did not think. I just moved. There was a split second where I smelled the whiskey in his glass and the cologne on his suit. That sharp, clean mix that always seemed to hang around rich men who were used to being obeyed. Then my shoulder slammed into his, harder than I meant to, and his chair scraped sideways. The sound of the shot and the sound of the glass exploding came together so tightly that I could not tell which was first. It was not like in the movies, no drawn-out ring of a single bullet. It was a violent crack that ripped the air clean open. The window behind him shattered in a howl of broken crystal and wind. Shards flew over us, little comets of reflected light slicing through candle glow and chandelier shine. The cold from the outside hit my face as the air rushed in, carrying lake chill and the distant smell of water and exhaust. I remember the thought flickering through me, wild and detached. I was right. It was real. This is actually happening. People screamed. Chairs scraped. Cutlery clattered. The hum of the restaurant collapsed into a mess of sound. Panicked voices. Someone crying. Someone yelling to get down. All the usual rules of the dining room evaporated in an instant. Etiquette replaced by raw fear. I did not hit the floor right away. For a half second, my body hovered in that no-man's land between balance and gravity. My weight tipped into him. Then the world snapped back, and we went down. His security moved faster than I did. Even as I was still falling, I felt another impact from the other side, the heavy presence of someone bigger and stronger shoving us toward the ground. My tray flew out of my hands, plates and glasses scattering, breaking, the crash of them swallowed up by the chaos. The carpet smelled like expensive cleaner and spilled wine. That is what I remember most in that first blurry moment on the floor. My cheek pressed into the weave, my ears full of noise, and my brain struggling to keep up. A weight pinned me down, solid and purposeful, not crushing but immovable. It took me a beat to realize the weight across my back and shoulder was a body, not a table or fallen chair. My wrist was caught in a grip so tight I could feel my pulse banging against someone's fingers. My first stupid thought was that I was being tackled by some random panicked guest. Then I heard him. Not the words at first, just the tone, that cold, steady cadence I had noticed when he read my note. It came from just above my ear, low and controlled, the one calm thing in the chaos. I understood, only then, that Adrian himself was covering me. Not just some guard, not some random human shield, but the man I had tried to save, pushing me down and using his own body as another barrier between me and the rain of glass and whatever else might be coming through that broken window. It was a strange, disorienting realization, lying there pinned under the weight of the danger and the protection at the same time. Around us, his people were moving with a kind of choreographed efficiency that made my stomach turn. This was not the first time they had dealt with something like this. I could feel that in the way they moved. They shouted instructions I could only half hear, their boots thudding against the carpet as they took positions, drew weapons from places I had not even noticed. Guests were scrambling toward the exits, some crawling, some running bent over, clutching handbags and jackets, and each other. The music had cut off mid-song, leaving only the raw, ugly noise of 100 fears colliding in one room. Someone near the bar was sobbing in that hiccuping way that means their lungs cannot decide whether to breathe or scream. I heard another gunshot then, closer to the ground this time, not through glass but through something solid. A chair toppled nearby, and a body hit the floor hard. Voices rose in a different pitch, the sharp crackle of commands layered over the general panic. The grip on my wrist shifted, not loosening but adjusting, fingers sliding to find the frantic thud under my skin. It was like he was checking if I was still there, still breathing, still real. I kept my face down because there was nowhere else to put it, and because I understood that staying small and invisible was still my best chance at surviving this. Seconds stretched. It could have been 10, could have been 60. Time does strange things when adrenaline is flooding your system. But gradually, the rhythm of the space changed. The screaming thinned out as people were herded toward the doors. The sounds near the bar and kitchen shifted from active threat to aftermath. Groans, curses, the shuffle of bodies being restrained. The wind through the broken window steadied into a constant presence instead of a shock. Only when the worst of the noise had ebbed did the weight on top of me ease. Adrian braced a hand on the floor and pushed himself just enough that I could wiggle my face to the side and suck in a full breath. My heart still felt like it was trying to punch out of my chest. I did not want to look up. Part of me was terrified that if I did, I would see someone lying too still nearby, blood seeping into the carpet. Another part of me was afraid of seeing his face, of seeing whether he was furious, grateful, suspicious, or all of the above. I forced my eyes to move anyway. Through the forest of chair legs and fallen napkins, I caught glimpses of the room. One of the men I had clocked earlier near the bar was on the ground, clutching his shoulder, his gun kicked several feet away, a dark stain spreading through the fabric of his jacket. Another near the kitchen had been taken down, leg twisted at an angle that made me wince even from a distance. They were alive, but neutralized, the kind of injuries that send a very clear message, without turning the floor into a crime scene. It struck me as a very specific choice, the kind someone like Adrian would make without needing to say it out loud. He shifted his hold on me, and his attention dropped back to my face for a moment. I could feel his gaze searching, checking for injuries. Little pieces of glass glittered on the carpet near my nose, and I was suddenly grateful for every cheap, ugly thing about my uniform that had stopped them from cutting into my skin. There was a question hanging between us, thicker than the dust in the air. Why did you do that? I did not have an answer that would satisfy someone whose whole world ran on calculations and risk assessments. Inside my own head, the answer was simple and impossible at the same time. Because I heard what she said. Because I could not stand in that bathroom and listen and then walk past your table pretending I did not know you were about to die. I do not know how long we stayed like that, me pinned under his arm, him half shielding me from a threat that had already spent its bullet. Long enough for the first faint wail of sirens to snake up through the broken window from the street below. Long enough for management to start doing the panicked dance of people who realize this will be a PR nightmare. At some point, he made another decision. You can always tell, with someone like him, when the switch flips and a new plan slides into place. His whole body seemed to sharpen around it. He rose in one controlled movement, pulling me up with him. My legs did not appreciate it. The sudden rush of blood back into them made my knees wobble. His hand on my elbow steadied me, firm but not rough. The restaurant looked like a war zone had just passed through, but a very clean, precise war zone. Broken glass glittered in a wide arc around the shattered window. Napkins lay scattered like fallen flags, and half-drunk glasses bled their contents onto the floor. But the bodies were alive, the worst of the damage contained. His people were already forming a human wall between the chaos and the path to the back of the restaurant. They were not in uniforms, but everything about them screamed structure and training. They moved diners with a mix of authority and urgency, guiding them toward the exits, deflecting questions, and ignoring accusations. My first instinct was to pull away, to say I needed to talk to the police, to tell someone in a badge about the bathroom, the call, the note. That was what you were supposed to do, right? You see something, you say something, you let the system handle it. But even as that thought formed, another one trampled it. I pictured myself sitting in a bright, cold interrogation room, trying to explain how a waitress with no connections and no reason just happened to overhear a murder plot and then happened to stand right next to the intended target when the bullet flew. I imagined the look on Detective Whoever's face, the way they would tilt their head when they asked if I had ever had contact with Adrian Cole's organization before. I also pictured whoever had sent that sniper, whoever had men inside this room, whoever had chosen Sloan as a conduit. Those people would not wait for the official report to come out. They would start looking for the leak the second everything went sideways. They would have seen the note. Or at least, they would have seen enough to know that something or someone tipped him off. And in a room full of rich people and bored staff, the girl who literally threw her body between the bullet and its target was not hard to pick out. All of that flickered through me in the space of a few strides as Adrian steered me toward the back. He did not yank or drag. He simply guided, and the current of his people flowed around us. No one stopped us, because who was going to step in front of the man who had just proven he was hard to kill? We slipped through the swinging kitchen doors into a different world. The air back there was hot and humid, full of steam and the smell of garlic and seared meat. Cooks and dishwashers froze mid-motion when they saw the state we were in. Eyes darting to the shattered glass glittering in my hair and the jagged edge of the broken window visible through the pass. My manager appeared out of nowhere, pale and sweating, sputtering questions and half-formed apologies, the word police tumbling out of his mouth more than once. I could tell he was trying to come up with excuses for why this had happened on his floor, in his section, under his watch. He looked at me like I was a problem he did not know how to categorize. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Whatever he said to my manager shut him up fast. And when he was done, the man stepped back as if someone had just reminded him exactly who signed the checks for this place, directly or otherwise. There was a service exit at the end of a narrow hallway, the kind I had used 100 times to take trash out or sneak a quick breath of fresh air on breaks. That night, it felt like the mouth of a tunnel leading somewhere I could not see the end of. A black SUV idled just beyond it, lights off, engine humming like a heartbeat. It struck me, as his hand tightened on my arm and his security formed a loose circle around us, that there were still choices here. I could stop, plant my feet on that cheap tile, and say I was staying. I could insist on waiting for the cops, for statements, for the official version of justice. But then I thought about Noah, home alone in an apartment that anyone with half a brain and a tiny bit of access could find. I thought about the man at the bar, and the 3 near the kitchen, about how their eyes had scanned the room earlier, taking everything in. I thought about the way that glint in the night had lined up perfectly with the back of Adrian's head. It hit me that the danger was not just his anymore. By warning him, by acting, by physically throwing myself into that line of fire, I had stamped my own name onto the ledger of this night. Whoever had paid for that bullet would want to know why it missed, and I was the annoying little variable that had made their math go wrong. So I let him lead me out the service door. The air on the loading dock was cold and sharp, smelling like dumpsters, wet concrete, and the faint metallic tang of the city's underbelly. The distant wail of sirens was louder out there, echoing between the buildings as more units converged on the front entrance. The SUV's rear door swung open, interior lit just enough to see the dark leather seats and the faint glow from the dashboard. It looked like every generic black car I had ever seen in crime shows. But this one was real. This one had a space in it waiting for me. Stepping toward it felt like pressing my hand against glass that might or might not be a mirror. I paused with one foot on the threshold, my hand still tucked in his. Behind us, the kitchen doors flapped, their porthole windows flashing glimpses of chaos and flashing lights. Ahead of us was only dim leather and tinted windows, and the knowledge that once I climbed in, I was not just a witness anymore. They talk a lot on the news about people getting mixed up in the wrong crowd, as if it happens by accident, like tripping on a sidewalk crack. Standing there on that loading dock, with gunpowder still stinging my nose and adrenaline buzzing in my veins, I realized that for me it had not been an accident. I had walked myself right to the edge and then stepped over, on purpose, on a flimsy, folded piece of paper. I got into the car. The door shut with a soft, final thud that felt a lot louder inside my head. As the SUV pulled away from the curb and the lights of Skyline 41 disappeared in the side mirror, I understood that I had just walked through a one-way door into Adrian Cole's world, and there was no easy way back. The ride from Skyline 41 to his building could not have been more than 15 minutes. It felt like being driven to another planet. I sat in the back of that SUV with my hands clenched so tightly in my lap my knuckles ached, watching downtown Chicago slide by in distorted smears through the tinted glass. The city looked different from inside a car like that. I was used to seeing it from sidewalks and bus windows, framed by the edges of crosswalks and the plastic seats of the L train. From here, everything felt sealed off, quieter, like I was already inside some invisible bubble that normal life could not quite touch. No one in the car talked much. The driver kept his eyes on the road, and one of Adrian's men in the front passenger seat scanned the sidewalks and intersections like he expected something to jump out at any second. Beside me, Adrian sat with his phone in one hand, the other resting relaxed but ready on his knee. Relaxed is a relative word, of course. Even in stillness, he had this coiled energy, as if his calm was just a thin layer covering something sharp. It made me weirdly aware of my own body, of how small I felt on the leather seat, of the way my uniform suddenly seemed to shout, "I do not belong here." My brain kept flipping through images like a deck of cards. The bathroom stall, the phone call, the folded receipt, the flash in the glass, the explosion of the window. Each picture came with its own slice of fear, guilt, and disbelief. Somewhere in the middle of all that, another image forced its way in. Noah, sitting cross-legged on our sagging couch with a controller in his hands, one sock on and one sock off, a plate with the crusts of grilled cheese on the coffee table in front of him. He had school in the morning. He would probably stay up too late anyway, flipping through channels after pretending to do homework. I had told him I would be back late, but I had meant the usual late, the kind where my feet hurt and my hair smelled like fryer oil, not the kind where I showed up at dawn with a different last name and a new life. The thought hit me so hard I almost reached for the door handle on instinct, as if we were just in some regular Uber and I could ask the driver to pull over so I could hop out and run home. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, because I understood something very clearly. If I jumped now, I would not be stepping back into the life I knew. I would be stepping out of the only moving shield I currently had. The car turned toward the lake. Lakefront Tower rose up out of the night like something out of a movie, all glass and steel, the lights of its upper floors glowing warm against the dark. I had seen it in magazines, in those articles about luxury living with words like exclusive and curated experiences that sounded like a different language when you were trying to keep a leaky sink from flooding your kitchen. We rolled past a security gate without stopping, the kind with a guard station and cameras that tracked you as you approached. The man inside barely glanced up when he saw the car, just pressed a button that made the arm lift, as we were expected. Maybe we were, maybe he always was. The SUV slid into an underground garage that smelled like clean concrete and money. Even the parking spaces looked expensive, with perfectly painted lines, polished floor, no oil stains or old gum. We pulled into a spot close to a private elevator lobby, the kind you only see in movies about people whose problems never include overdue electric bills. My legs felt strangely heavy when I climbed out. I was still in my black work pants and worn-out shoes, still had slivers of glass glittering in my hair, But now I was standing in a garage full of smooth, sleek cars that cost more than I would make in a decade. The difference between my world and his had never felt sharper. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Inside, there were no floor buttons, just a key slot and a small panel. One of his men slid a card in, tapped in a code, and the doors closed, sealing us in with our reflections. It was the first time I got a good look at myself since the bathroom. The mirrored walls showed a girl who looked like she had wandered into the wrong frame. Hair pulled back, a few strands stuck to her forehead, uniform wrinkled, eyes too wide and too tired. For a moment, I saw myself the way someone like Adrian must see me, not as the center of some story, but as a variable that had suddenly become important. A problem to solve, a piece to protect or remove, depending on which column she ended up in. The elevator stopped without the usual lurch I was used to from the ones in our building. The doors slid open directly into a living space. No hallway, no neighbors. It felt less like stepping into an apartment, and more like crossing a border. The penthouse was all clean lines and open space, the kind of place interior designers use in portfolios. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the main room, giving a panoramic view of the lake, the city, and the glittering ribbon of traffic snaking along Lakeshore Drive. When I walked forward, the polished stone floor reflected back the lights in a faint, ghostly version of my own silhouette. I felt like I had been dropped into one of those photos you scroll past on your phone and never imagine yourself standing inside. Everything had that subtle, expensive quality you only notice when you have spent your life around things that are worn out. The weight of the kitchen chairs, the sheen of the countertops, the way the cabinets closed without a sound. Even the air felt softer somehow, filtered and conditioned, carrying a faint hint of something expensive and unidentifiable. I did not belong there. Every cell in my body understood that. This was a fortress wrapped in luxury, and I was just a girl who had learned to stretch dollar store cleaning supplies and cheap coffee. Part of me wanted to start scrubbing, just to have something familiar to do. Another part wanted to curl up in a corner and pretend this was all some weird dream I could wake up from if I tried hard enough. Instead, I stood very still and tried not to think about the fact that my phone was still in my apron pocket, heavy with unanswered texts I had not even seen yet. That was when the fear for Noah came back, full force. It had never really left, but walking into that penthouse amplified it. The difference between this place and our building was brutal. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up with peeling paint and a front door that never quite latched right unless you kicked it. Anyone could come and lean against the buzzer until someone let them in, or wait by the back alley door for a tenant to slip. There were cameras, technically, but half of them did not work, and the footage was only useful if you knew someone who knew someone. Here, there were layers, guards, codes, cameras that probably streamed to multiple screens and backups. If someone wanted to get to Tomum or here, they would have to get through this whole machine built around a man who did not like to be touched by fate. It hit me hard that Noah was still in our version of the world. Alone, unaware, just a kid who thought his biggest problem was a math test, and the fact that we were out of his favorite cereal. I realized that even if I was wrapped in glass and steel now, he was still out there, exposed. I did not need anyone to tell me that made him a target. Whoever had set up the hit would start pulling on every thread they could find. Witnesses, staff lists, security footage, phone logs. My name would float up sooner or later, and from there, our address was just a matter of patience. That thought was the moment my panic changed flavor. Up until then, it had mostly been about me, about what would happen if I said the wrong thing, if I went to the wrong person, if I stayed or left. Now it narrowed down to one point. My little brother, asleep under a too-thin blanket in a too-thin walled apartment. I pulled my phone out with hands that did not feel like they belonged to me. The screen lit up with missed calls from my manager, texts from my coworker asking if I was okay, and a notification from the transit app reminding me about some schedule change on my usual train line. Nothing from Noah yet, which meant he was either fine or did not realize he should be worried. In any other version of my night, I would have sent him a quick text, something like running late, lock the door, and go to sleep, love you. But every instinct I had screamed that tonight, that would not be enough. Tonight, A locked door and a neighbor down the hall were not the kind of protection we needed. I remember standing there in that luxurious living room and feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I had spent years convincing myself I was capable, that I could handle things, that I did not need anyone to swoop in and save us. Suddenly, I was face to face with a level of threat I could not reach with my bare hands and stubbornness. The awful part was that I knew exactly who could reach it. There are moments you look back on and realize they were pivots, the points where you turned in a direction you can never untake. Agreeing to let Adrian's people go to our apartment and get Noah was one of those points. I did not come to it quickly or gracefully. In my head, a whole list of fears shouted over each other. The idea of strangers showing up at our door in the middle of the night, of Noah being shoved into some car by men he had never seen before, the risk of drawing even more attention to him, of dragging him deeper into this world instead of away from it. But it came down to this. If the people who wanted Adrian dead were even half as resourceful as I suspected, they already had our address. Leaving Noah there was not keeping him safe. It was leaving him undefended. My pride and my preference for handling things on my own did not matter next to that. The decision did not feel heroic. It felt like giving up control, like handing the last piece of my old life to someone else. I hated it. I hated asking for help from a man whose world had already swallowed my night whole. I did it anyway. If there is one thing about being the responsible kid in a broken family, it is that you learn to choose the option that scares you if it also keeps your people alive. Even if it means trusting someone you barely know with the one person you would die for. Time stretched out strangely after that. People moved around me, soft-footed men in dark clothing checking door locks and camera feeds, voices low and efficient. Adrian disappeared into what looked like an office off the main room. Phone pressed to his ear, his posture all sharp angles and command. I wandered a few steps toward the windows. The view made the city look peaceful, almost gentle. A dark sheet scattered with lights. It was disorienting, seeing something so familiar from such a different angle. Down there, people were closing up corner stores, walking dogs, heading home from late shifts. Maybe some waitress was wiping down her last table of the night, stretching her back, and thinking about bills. They had no idea there had been a bullet through a restaurant window not that long ago. No idea their skyline view had been part of a crosshair. I pressed my palm lightly against the glass. It was cool and smooth beneath my skin, solid, reassuring in a way. Behind me, this place had locks and cameras and layers of protection. In front of me, the city sprawled out in all its messy, dangerous beauty. I did not know how much time had passed before I heard the soft chime of the private elevator. My heart jumped into my throat before my brain could remind it that the police would not be coming up that way, at least not without a fight. Footsteps echoed on the stone floor, lighter than the heavy tread of the security team. I turned around just as the door from the elevator alcove opened fully. There he was, hoodie half-zipped, hair sticking up in all directions, sneakers scuffed, eyes narrowed in that suspicious, too-adult way he had picked up way too early. Noah. For a heartbeat, the penthouse, the glass, the lake, all of it blurred. All I saw was my little brother standing in the doorway of a world he had never asked to enter. And I knew, with a clarity that made my chest hurt, that whatever happened from this point on, nothing about our lives was going back to the way it was. Noah's first words when he saw me were not exactly the tearful reunion type. His eyebrows pulled together, and I could see the moment his brain took in the penthouse, the view, the men in dark clothes, and the man standing a few feet behind me. If suspicion had a face, it would have been my little brother in that hoodie, glaring past me like I had dragged him onto a movie set without asking. I moved first. I crossed the room and pulled him into a hug that was more for me than for him. For 4 whole seconds, he let me hold on. Then his arms came up in that stiff way that said he was hugging back, but he was also already demanding answers in his head. Up close, he smelled like the laundry detergent we always bought on sale, and the inside of our old apartment, that mix of ramen, dust, and the neighbor's cooking that seeped through the walls. It hit me like a punch that this kid was my anchor to the life I knew, and I had just tossed that anchor into very deep, dark water. When I let go, he gave me that look, the one that said he knew it too. I could see the questions forming behind his eyes. Why did strangers pick him up in the middle of the night? Why were there floor-to-ceiling windows instead of peeling paint? Why did the man by the kitchen look like someone out of a crime documentary and not like a landlord or a teacher? 13-year-olds are not stupid, especially those who grow up in neighborhoods where they learn how to read danger early. I did what I always did when things got too big and messy. I started to explain and hoped I could smooth the worst of it over. I framed it as an incident at work, as security precautions, and as temporarily staying somewhere safer until things calmed down. I talked about how there had been a dangerous situation, and how I needed him near me while it got sorted. I did not lie about everything, but I did trim the edges. I did not tell him about the bathroom stall, or the glint of the sniper scope, or the way glass sounded when it exploded right behind your back. I did not mention the word Mafia because once you name a monster like that out loud to a kid, you cannot take it back. Noah listened with that unnerving quiet he had stolen straight from our mother. His eyes kept sliding past me to the rest of the room, lingering on the artwork, the kitchen, the men who pretended not to be listening but absolutely were. I could see him adding things up in his head, and I knew he was landing somewhere near the truth, even if he did not have the vocabulary for it. Adrian gave us space, which I appreciated and resented at the same time. He stayed a few feet away, posture loose, presence unmistakable. He did not try to insert himself into the conversation or charm Noah, or soften the edges. He just watched. Like he understood that this was a moment between siblings he had barged into, and was trying not to make it worse. Eventually, Noah stopped asking why, and switched to his usual coping mechanism, which was pretending he was fine. He shrugged, said something about at least this place having decent Wi-Fi, and probably food that was not microwave pizza. It was the kind of joke that sounded light, but I could hear the tremor underneath. I showed him the guest room that would be his for the night. I pointed out the bathroom, the fact that the door actually locked without having to lift it and jiggle the knob just so, and the extra blankets stacked neatly in the closet. He tried to act unimpressed, but I saw the way his eyes widened at the size of the bed and the fact that the window looked out over the whole city. When he finally went to change and pretend to settle in, I stepped back into the main room and felt a wave of exhaustion hit me hard enough that I had to grab the back of a chair. My body was running on fumes and adrenaline, my mind cycling through the events of the night like a messed-up highlight reel. Part of me wanted to collapse right there, on the polished floor, and sleep for a week. Instead, I drifted over to the couch and sank down like my bones had given up. The penthouse had gone quieter, the initial flurry of movement settling into a lower, steadier hum. Men spoke into earpieces, phones chimed softly, and somewhere in another room, I heard the faint clack of keys on a laptop. My phone was still in my hand. I had not really let go of it since I texted Noah an apology for not being home at the time I said I would be, a message he had apparently not seen before. Adrian's people picked him up. Now, finally, I had a second to look down at the screen and see what the world outside this glass bubble had been doing while I was busy dodging bullets. There were missed calls from my manager, a string of increasingly frantic messages from Amy, the other server who usually covered the section next to mine. She asked if I was okay, said the cops had locked down the restaurant, and mentioned hearing words like targeted incident and organized. Each notification felt like a reminder that there was still a version of my life where I was just a girl worried about clocking in on time for another shift. I did not realize I had drifted off until my phone vibrated in my hand and jolted me back. It was not a long sleep, more like the kind of micro-nap your body snatches in crisis, where 10 minutes feels like 10 seconds and 10 hours all at once. The apartment lights were dimmed now, the lake outside darker, the city glow softer. For a heartbeat, I thought the buzzing was just another text from Amy or my manager. My thumb swiped across the screen out of habit, and then all the remaining sleepiness snapped right out of me. The name at the top was not one I recognized, just a number with no contact photo, and the first words made my blood run cold. Whoever it was had decided to call me Little Bird. It would have sounded almost sweet if it had not been wrapped around a clear warning that I should have kept my beak shut. The message was written in that kind of casual, almost playful tone that made the threat underneath it even uglier. They made it very clear that they knew who I was. Not just Lily the waitress at Skyline 41, but Lily with the apartment 3 floors up in a building with a broken buzzer. Lily had a 13-year-old brother who walked home from school past a vacant lot and a corner store with bars on the windows. The second message came before I had finished reading the first. It mentioned my street by name, described the chipped blue paint on our front door like they were strolling past it as they typed. It told me in the kind of language people use when they want to scare you without having to describe specifics that next time, Adrian would not be fast enough to drag me out of the way. My fingers were shaking so badly by the time the third notification lit up the screen that I almost dropped the phone. This one was not text at all, but a photo. At first, my brain refused to process it, as it had just decided enough was enough for one night. It was our building. Taken from across the street at an angle I recognized instantly, because I had seen that view every time I turned the corner after getting off the bus. The porch light was on, the crooked number above the door glowing tiredly like it always did. There were a few details that told me it was recent, not something pulled from Google or some old file. Mrs. Chang's second-floor window was lit. She always fell asleep with the TV on and the sound too loud. The plastic Halloween decoration Noah had forgotten to take down from our door was still hanging lopsided, even though October was long over. It was like someone had taken a snapshot of my fear and sent it back to me. I felt my stomach twist. A sick, hollow churn that made the room tilt a little. My first instinct was to run down the hall and drag Noah out of bed, to show him the photo, to say, "See, this is why you are not at home tonight." But I stopped myself. I am his sister. Not his equal, not yet. He is still a kid, no matter how sharp his eyes are and how grown his questions sound. And there are weights you do not put on the shoulders of a kid if you have any other choice. So instead of going to him, I went to the one person in the apartment who could actually do something about it. Fear has a way of sharpening your focus. I stood up, legs shaky but moving, and followed the faint glow coming from the office down the hall. Adrian was there, as if he had never left. Jacket off now, sleeves rolled up, phone on speaker on the desk, laptop open to something that looked like a storm of numbers and boxes. He was in the middle of a sentence when he saw my face, and whatever he had been saying cut off. The person on the other end kept talking for a few beats before he hung up without a word. I did not bother with a preamble. Words felt thick in my throat, so I just held out my phone. I think my hand was trembling, because he reached for it a little faster than usual, like he was afraid I might drop it. He read the messages in silence. His eyes scanned each line, then slid to the photo, lingering there for a second longer than they had on the text. I watched his jaw tighten in that way I had noticed at the restaurant, that tiny, almost invisible warning sign that something in him had gone from passive to lethal. I had seen him controlled, calm, calculating. This was different. It was like the temperature in the room dropped without the thermostat moving. Whatever humanity was visible in his face when he talked about his father or his past earlier that night receded. In its place was something harder, colder. The version of himself that had survived long enough to become who he was. If I had not been so scared, it might have scared me on its own. For a second, a ridiculous thought flashed through my mind that he might blame me. That he would tell me this was what happened when you stuck your nose where it did not belong, that I had dragged my brother into his mess. I half expected anger directed at me. Disappointment. Some flavor of this is exactly why I did not want you involved. That is not what came. If anything, the danger in his eyes swung outward, like a gun barrel changing target. This was not rage at me for being a problem. It was rage at whoever had dared to circle what he had decided to protect. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The tone he used carried enough weight to make the air feel denser. He snapped out orders. Not in full sentences I can quote back to you, but in a series of sharp instructions that had names and locations and time frames attached. Within moments, Marco appeared in the doorway, moving with that attentive readiness I had started to associate with him. Adrian handed him my phone, pointed at the numbers, at the photo, at something in his own laptop feed. They spoke in a shorthand that told me this was not the first time they had hunted someone through pixels and signals. He wanted the number traced, the area around my old building pulled up on every camera they had access to, and the last hour of movement within a certain radius reviewed. He treated the messages not just as a threat, but as a mistake, evidence that could be used to pull the sender out into the light. I realized, watching him, that whoever had texted me had done the most dangerous thing you can do with a man like this, made it personal. Standing there barefoot in borrowed sweats, I felt a strange mix of terror and relief. Terror, because the threats were now undeniably real and close, etched into my screen. Relief, because for the first time since that bathroom stall, I was not the only one carrying the knowledge of them. He looked at me again, taking in the way I was hugging my own arms, the way I kept glancing toward the hall where Noah slept. He told me, in that flat, certain way he had, that my brother was safe, that his men were watching every entrance to the building we used to call home, that whoever took that photo had just given them a head start. It was not a promise he made lightly, and I believed him because I had seen what he was willing to do when someone pointed a gun at his head. Something in me loosening did not mean the fear went away. I was still shaking, still on the verge of tears. I did not want to cry in front of him. My life had been one long exercise in not falling apart where anyone could see. He must have recognized that brittle feeling, because he did not tell me to calm down or to be rational. He just told me to focus on what was in front of me, which right now was making sure Noah stayed asleep, stayed blissfully ignorant of just how close the dark was pressing in. It was a strange comfort, having someone else outline my priorities when my brain wanted to spin. When I walked back down the hall toward the guest rooms, the messages still burned in my mind. Little bird. They had given me a nickname without my consent, a label that felt like a target painted between my shoulder blades. I paused outside Noah's door and listened. I could hear the faint rustle of blankets, the steady breath of a kid who had not seen the photo that had just changed the shape of my night. If he asked me in the morning why he was here, why all of this was happening, I would find a way to tell him the truth without handing him my fear. I leaned my head back against the cool wall and closed my eyes. Somewhere in this glass tower, armed men were rewinding footage, tracing signals, moving pieces around a board I could not see. Somewhere out there, someone who liked sending creepy texts had no idea yet what kind of storm they had just called down on themselves. That was when it really sank in. I was no longer just the waitress who had overheard the wrong conversation and made a reckless choice. I had become a piece of leverage, a pressure point, a weak spot in the armor of a man who had very few. To the people who wanted him dead, I was a problem that needed to be removed or exploited. To him, I had just become something else entirely, something he would not allow to be touched without consequence. And that was the most terrifying part, realizing that I was now both the risk and the reason he was about to go to war. I do not know when the apartment finally went quiet. At some point, the low murmur of voices in the office faded, footsteps grew less frequent, and doors stopped opening and closing. Silence in a place that big feels different than silence in a one-bedroom. It settles heavier, like there is more space for it to fill. Sleep was not happening. Every time I closed my eyes, my brain replayed the night on a loop, always lingering a little too long on the photo of our building glowing on my phone screen. I lay there in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the ventilation and the faint whoosh of cars far below. The clock on the bedside table glowed 3 in the morning. It is the hour when most of the city is as close to asleep as it ever gets, when delivery trucks prowl empty streets, and insomniacs stare at digital ceilings. For me, it has always been the hour when worries feel the loudest, when the dark stretches longer. I tried all my usual tricks, counting breaths, listing things I was grateful for, making fake grocery lists in my head to trick my brain into thinking about something boring. None of it worked. Adrenaline still had too firm a grip on my nervous system. Eventually, I gave up. There is only so long you can lie perfectly still and pretend rest is just around the corner. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, bare feet touching the cool floor, and padded toward the hallway. The penthouse was dim, lit mostly by the glow bleeding in from the city through the windows. It cast everything in soft blue and gold, like the whole place was underwater. I could see the outline of furniture, the shape of the kitchen, and the big open space of the living room. I thought for a second that I was alone out there. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw him. Adrian was sitting in one of the leather chairs facing the glass, a dark shape framed by the sweep of the lake and the muffled city lights. He had not turned on any lamps. The only light near him came from the faint amber of whatever he was drinking, catching when he tilted the glass. He looked like part of the skyline, another solid line in a world made of angles and reflections. He did not startle when I stepped closer. Of course he didn't. Men who live the way he does probably get uncomfortable if something actually manages to surprise them. For a moment, I thought about turning around, going back to bed, leaving him to his insomnia and his secrets. He was still very much a stranger, even after everything we had been through in a single night. But something pulled me forward. The same something that had made me write that note in the first place instead of just pretending I heard nothing. I sank into the chair next to his. The leather felt cold at first, then warmed under my skin. We both stared out at the city for a few seconds, the silence between us not quite comfortable but not hostile either. He looked tired in a way I had not noticed before. Not physically, exactly, though there were faint shadows under his eyes that suggested he did not treat sleep as a regular part of his routine. It was more in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself. Like someone who had been braced against impact for so long he no longer remembered what real rest felt like. He told me, eventually, that sleep was a luxury in his line of work. Not in a bragging way, not as some macho badge of honor, just as a flat fact. Too many moving pieces, too many enemies, too much to lose if he let his guard down for too long. It is strange. The things you end up talking about at 3 a.m. with someone you barely know. The edges soften. The usual armor people wear in daylight loosens. In that liminal space, between exhaustion and alertness, people sometimes tell the truth by accident. He started with something simple. He talked about growing up in a part of the city that never made it onto postcards, where you learned early to tell the difference between firecrackers and gunshots. He described a walk-up apartment that sounded not so different from the one Noah and I lived in, the smell of cooking drifting through thin walls, neighbors who knew too much about each other's business. His father worked 3 jobs, warehouse shifts, side gigs, whatever he could get to keep lights on and food on the table. The way Adrian described him, I could hear both respect and resentment threaded through the story, like the man had been both a hero and a warning. Then his father borrowed money from the wrong people. It was not a dramatic setup. It was something painfully mundane, like a hospital bill or a run of bad luck at work. He could not pay it back fast enough, and the men who came to discuss the debt did not come to talk. Adrian told me about coming home from school one day to find his father on the floor, breathing but broken, legs twisted, blood on the cheap linoleum, his mother screaming into a phone that no one on the other end seemed to answer quickly enough. He said it clinically, but there was a crack in his voice so small you would miss it if you were not listening for it. He told me about the hospital smell, about the way his father's eyes looked when he realized he would never walk right again, about the anger that settled into him, thick and bitter, at a world where hard work had not been enough to keep his family safe. There are men who could walk into someone's life, ruin it, and walk back out as if they had just finished a chore. That was the day, he said, when he learned that power is not given. You take it, or you live at the mercy of people who do. And he had decided very young that he was done being at anyone's mercy. I sat there and listened, feeling this strange mix of pity and alarm. It is one thing to hear rumors about someone's past, another to hear the story from their own mouth, stripped of legend. The man the city whispered about was suddenly, in that moment, just a kid who had watched his father get broken like a piece of cheap furniture. He did not pretend he joined some noble mission after that. There were no fantasies about cleaning up the streets, no illusions about being a secret savior. He moved into the cracks between legal and illegal, because that was where the power was. And the more he took, the more insulated he and the few people he cared about became. He mentioned, almost in passing, that there had been someone else once. A friend, a partner, someone he had trusted more than anyone. They had built something together, territory, business, a network that stretched across ports and clubs and warehouses. Then that friend sold him out. It was not a small betrayal. It was the kind that ends with bullets and fire and hospital beds. He glossed over the details, but the scars were there, not on his skin where I could see them, but in every careful calculation, in every contingency plan, in the way he watched the world. He said the last time he let someone close cost him almost everything. His words did not come with self-pity. They came with cold math. When you live in his world, Trust is not romantic. It is an operational risk. Listening to him, I thought about all the ways people mask their wounds. Some people drink them away. Some people joke them away. Some people bury them under layers of work and denial. Adrian had built an empire over his, a structure so dense that very few people could get close enough to see what it was hiding. At some point, the conversation turned. Maybe it was inevitable, given the hour and the shared silence, that he asked about my scars too, the invisible ones. Up until then, I had been content to let him talk, to stay in observer mode. But there is something about being offered someone else's truth that makes you feel obligated to share some of your own. So I told him about our mother, about how she worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices by night and stocking shelves by day, until her body finally decided it had had enough. About the way the house felt after she was gone, strangely bigger and at the same time much too small. I told him about our father in the vaguest possible way, about how he had opened the fridge one day, seen nothing inside, and decided he preferred a life where he did not have to feel that particular emptiness. About how he left without slamming the door, because slamming it would have felt too much like acknowledging us. I told him about being 16 and realizing there was no backup plan, no distant relative about to sweep in and fix everything. About dropping out of school to work full-time, telling teachers and counselors that it was temporary, that I would get my GED eventually. About learning how to stretch tips and coupons. How to fake normalcy so Noah would not realize just how precarious everything was. Saying it out loud made me feel exposed. These were the things I usually kept neatly folded in the back of my mind, like clothes you do not wear anymore but cannot bring yourself to throw out. Sharing them with a man like him was the emotional equivalent of walking out on a balcony with no railing. He listened. He did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes, did not tell me I was strong or brave or any of the phrases people use when they want to make themselves feel better about your struggle. He just listened, in that intensely focused way that made you feel like every word was being logged and filed somewhere important. When I finished, the room felt different. Not lighter exactly, but less brittle. We sat there, 2 people from very different corners of the same city, both shaped by debts we did not incur and violence we did not choose. There was a strange kind of understanding in that shared space. Not forgiveness for who he was, not approval, but recognition. He had built his walls out of steel and money. I had built mine out of jokes and long hours and keeping my head down. The irony was not lost on me. For years, my survival strategy had been to stay invisible, to avoid the notice of men exactly like him. And now here I was, sitting next to one in his penthouse at 3 in the morning, both of us too awake and too tired to pretend this was normal. The quiet between us stretched just long enough for my shoulders to start unknotting. Then his phone buzzed on the side table, a small, sharp sound that sliced through the fragile peace. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, and the part of his face I had just seen soften hardened right back up. Whatever message he read brought us slamming back into the present. The focus snapped into his eyes again, that cold, assessing look that meant someone somewhere had made a move. He typed something back quickly, fingers moving with the ease of someone who is always half in a conversation you cannot hear. He told me, in that clipped way he had when shifting into action mode, that they had traced some of the movement tied to my little blackmail texts. Not just the number, but where the orders had originated, where the money had flowed. The threads led, unsurprisingly, back to a name already burned into that night. Sloane. She had not vanished into shock or remorse. She was holed up in a different kind of luxury, at an upscale hotel across town, making plans of her own. She was not meeting with more gunmen this time. She was meeting with a reporter. If the bullets had failed, she was ready to try another kind of weapon, a story. The idea of her sitting in a plush suite at some place like the Regency Chicago, rehearsing lines about being the terrified girlfriend of a dangerous man, made my stomach twist. She would paint herself as the victim, him as the monster, and if she needed to throw a nameless waitress under the bus to make it more compelling, she would not hesitate. I could already hear the headline in my head. It would not just be his name in that story. It would be mine. The girl who overheard the wrong thing, the one who pushed him out of the way, the civilian caught in the crossfire. In the hands of a hungry reporter, I would become a prop in her redemption arc. In the eyes of law enforcement and rival organizations, I would become something else. A liability, a witness, an accomplice, depending on who was spinning the narrative. Either way, I would be visible in a way I could not control. Adrian stood up, the decision already made. He said they had a location, a time, a room number. She was not just hiding. She was actively trying to reposition herself, and in doing so, she was about to drag me back into the light again. He looked at me then, really looked, like he was measuring whether I was going to break or bend. He told me I could stay, that he would handle it, that I did not need to see the rest of the ugliness tied to the night I had started. He said it like an offer, but also like he was testing me. Part of me wanted to say yes, absolutely, leave me here. Let me pretend for a few hours that my life had not been turned inside out. Let me sit on this couch and watch the lake and try to forget that a woman with red lipstick and a soft laugh had tried to orchestrate a murder between courses. Let me be small again, for just a moment. But there was another part of me, the same part that had listened in that bathroom stall and refused to shrug and walk away. That part wanted to know exactly what I had interrupted, what I had saved, what I was now on the hook for. If I was going to live with the consequences of this night, I needed to see them clearly. So when he said I could stay, I heard the unspoken second option. Or you can come with me. And as terrifying as that was, as reckless as it sounded, I knew which one I was going to choose. When I told him I was coming, I half expected an argument. Instead, he just watched me for a few seconds, like he was checking whether this was panic talking or something solid. Then he nodded once and shifted into motion. Within minutes, the quiet penthouse snapped back into a low, humming readiness as his people fell into place. It was 3:30 in the morning when we stepped back into the private elevator, the kind of hour when most of the city pretends danger is asleep, even though it never really is. I stood between Adrian and Marco, wearing borrowed jeans and a plain sweatshirt that somehow fit, with my hair pulled into a low knot that still sprinkled tiny shards of glass when I touched it. The SUV ride to the hotel felt different from the one that had brought me to the penthouse. On the way there, I had been in shock, half convinced I would wake up back in the staff bathroom with my 5-minute break already over. Now I knew for certain that I was awake and that this was my life, and that grim clarity made every passing street lamp feel like a checkpoint. We cut across the river and headed toward one of those hotels you only see in glossy magazines or in shots of downtown during big sports broadcasts. The Lakeshore Regency rose up ahead of us, all polished stone and glittering windows, the kind of place that smells like money the moment you walk in. It felt almost ironic, driving toward another glass tower after watching one explode from the inside. Marco briefed Adrian in low tones as we rode the elevator up from the underground parking. Room number, cameras they had already hijacked. The fact that Sloan had ordered champagne to the suite just after 2:45 in the morning. He mentioned another presence, too. A man they had identified from previous surveillance as someone tied to an Eastern European outfit that had been sniffing around the docks for the last year. Hearing that confirmed what my gut already knew. The bullet at Skyline 41 had not been some personal melodrama between Sloan and Adrian. It was business. Territory, ports, money. The kind of things that get people killed all the time quietly. The elevator that took us up to the top floor was not public. We moved through a side corridor, past a concierge station where the man on duty suddenly became very attentive to his computer screen, and stepped into a lift that needed both a keycard and a code. The mirrored walls caught our reflections again, but this time my face looked less like a stranger and more like someone who had been dragged into the plot and was trying to keep her footing. My heart started to hammer harder the moment the doors opened onto the top floor. Hotel hallways at that hour have a special kind of quiet, padded, and expectant. The carpet swallowed our footsteps as we approached the double doors of the presidential suite. Adrian moved as if he belonged there. There was no hesitation in his stride, no glance back to check if I had changed my mind. His world is about momentum. Once he commits to a direction, he does not second-guess it in front of anyone. Marco slipped a device from his pocket, something small and black that he pressed against the electronic lock. There was a soft click, the light on the panel flickered, and then the handle turned under his hand like it had been waiting for us. We walked in without knocking. The suite was all cream and gold and unnecessary space, the kind of room designed to make important people feel even more important. Big windows looked out over the lake. A bar gleamed in one corner, and soft jazz played from speakers hidden somewhere in the walls. If you did not know better, you would think it was a scene set for a romantic getaway, not a post-assassination debrief. Sloane stood near the bar, glass of champagne in hand, bare feet on the plush carpet, silk robe tied loosely over something that probably cost more than my rent. For a second, she did not see us. She was too busy practicing a look in the mirrored backsplash behind the bottles, that perfect mix of wounded and brave she had always been good at. When her eyes finally landed on us in the reflection, I watched the color drain from her face. There were two men in the main room. One of them leaned against the back of the sofa. Dark suit, salt and pepper hair, eyes like polished stones that had seen too many negotiations. The other was younger, built with the solid heaviness of someone who uses his body as a tool, standing just close enough to the older man to be a barrier if needed. I did not need an introduction to understand who they were. Power sits in a room in a specific way, and these two carried it like a shared coat. This had to be the head of the syndicate and his right hand. The ones who had thrown their lot in with Sloane when she decided she was done sharing her life with a man like Adrian. For a moment, I stood just behind Adrian's shoulder, listening. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations. Instead, it felt like walking into the middle of a negotiation that had just gone sideways. Sloane tried to slide into whatever version of the story she had prepared for the reporter. She talked about fear, about feeling trapped, about wanting out. She framed the hit at Skyline 41 as a necessary evil, a clean break, a quick ending she had been assured would be painless and precise. She said she had been promised control. She had convinced herself that if she delivered Adrian, the men now standing across from us would let her keep the rest of her life. She would trade one kind of danger for another, and come out, if not clean, then at least alive and detached. Listening to her, I felt my jaw tighten. It was not that I thought Adrian was innocent, or that he did not bring certain risks into the lives of people around him. It was the chill in her voice when she talked about it, the way she minimized what it meant to hand a person over to people whose job it was to erase problems. She thought she had moved from one side of the board to another, but she was still a piece. That realization flickered across her face as Adrian laid out what he knew, connecting the dots from the bathroom call to the men in the restaurant to the money trail Marco had dug up. This was not a jealous lover bursting in. This was a man who had done his homework. The older man, the syndicate leader, watched all of this with a kind of detached curiosity. He did not apologize for the bullet. He framed it as business, a necessary attempt to redraw lines on the map of the city. To him, I was barely a factor, an unexpected variable who had thrown off the equation, but still, ultimately, a detail. He made the mistake of addressing me directly at one point, in that smooth, condescending way some older men use when they think they are talking to someone too young and too female to matter. He implied that I must be very brave or very foolish to have interfered, that I had stepped into a game I did not understand. He hinted that accidents happen to people who do not know when to stay quiet. The thing about spending your whole life trying not to rock boats is that sometimes, once you finally stand up, you do not know how to sit back down. I heard my own voice before I had fully decided what I wanted to say. I told him that whatever game they thought they were playing, it involved real people whose lives did not exist just to make their deals cleaner. I did not frame it as a speech. It was more like a confession delivered at the wrong altar. I admitted that I was nobody, that I had no idea how to move in their world without crashing into something. But I also told him that when I heard a woman casually describe the logistics of killing someone she shared a bed with, I could not just walk by and pretend I had not heard it. I said that if that made me stupid, I could live with stupid. What I could not live with was the image of sitting back and watching, of telling myself it was not my problem and then seeing his head explode against that restaurant window. The room went quiet after that in a way you can feel in your teeth. For the first time since we walked in, Adrian's attention shifted fully to me. He had been watching, of course, tracking every move, but now his focus sharpened in a way that made heat creep up the back of my neck. I realized I had said more than I meant to, exposed more than I intended, to a room full of people who could weaponize anything. The syndicate boss smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He called me moral, the way some people say naive. Then he turned back to Adrian and said, in a tone that was almost amused, that people like me do not last long in worlds like theirs. That was when I saw the real version of Adrian that the city whispered about. Up until then, I had seen pieces. The calculated calm, the quick decisions, the protective reflex when the glass exploded. Now I watched him step fully into the role of a man who makes other men afraid. His body language changed first. He was not just standing tall. He was taking up space in a way that made the room feel smaller. His words came slow and measured, but there was no room in them for negotiation. He laid out what he had on them, not just from tonight but from months of watching. Financial trails, shell companies, shipments that had mysteriously failed inspections at just the wrong time. He talked about the leverage he held like he was reading a grocery list. Nothing emotional, all facts. He made it clear that if they even breathed in my direction again, if they let my name cross their lips in a threatening way, the evidence he had would not just go to the cops. It would go to their rivals, to the people above them, to anyone who could and would use it to dismantle everything they had built. He did not threaten violence. He threatened annihilation. It was not a movie monologue. No raised voice, no dramatic gestures. It was worse, because it was calm and specific and entirely believable. The older man went pale under his tan, a thin sheen of sweat appearing along his hairline. The younger one, the enforcer, shifted his weight, clearly thinking through the odds of reaching for the gun hidden under his jacket. Marco's posture changed instantly, his own hand hovering near his weapon, and for a second I could feel the whole future of the room teetering on the edge of someone's bad decision. Then the enforcer thought better of it and relaxed his fingers. Sloane had gone very quiet by then. Her eyes flicked from Adrian to the men she had thrown in with, and I could see the moment she realized they would not save her if it cost them too much. For all her planning, she had underestimated just how small she was on their board. Adrian turned to her last. There was no shouting, no name-calling, nothing you would recognize from staged reality show breakups. He told her, as simply as if he were reading a weather report, that she was dead to him now. Not dead in the physical sense, although I understood that he could have chosen that route, and no one in that room would have really been surprised. Dead in the sense that she no longer existed in any of the circles she had once moved in. No more access, no more invitations, no more protection. He offered her one thing instead. Marco had already prepared it, because of course he had. This confrontation was not improvised. An envelope with a bank card linked to an account with a clean but limited amount of money. A ticket to a city far away where her name meant nothing. The conditions were simple. She took the out quietly. She signed paperwork promising to keep certain stories to herself, or she stayed and watched the recordings and transactions he had collected about her leak into places that would make her very public life very ugly. In that moment, for all her beauty and poise, she looked very small, standing there in that hotel suite, watching a woman who had almost gotten him killed wobble on the edge of her choices. I understood something about Adrian I had only guessed at before. He did not just survive his world. He shaped it. And somehow, for reasons I still did not fully understand, he had decided that I was now part of the territory he would not let anyone redraw without a fight. On the ride back, the city outside the SUV windows started to lighten at the edges. Dawn was still a long way off, but the deepest part of the night had passed. Inside the car, the air felt charged, not with the sharp fear of earlier, but with the heavy awareness that nothing about my life would ever be simple again. By the time the sun finally pushed a gray wash of light over the lake, my body was so tired it had moved past exhaustion into something hollow. You would think that after a night like that, sleep would crash over you the second you touched a pillow, but fear has its own kind of caffeine. Instead of resting, my mind kept circling the same questions, and at the center of all of them was the same fact. In a few hours, I had to sit in a room with the police and decide what story I was going to live with. The morning moved fast and slow at the same time. On the surface, everything looked oddly normal. Coffee brewing in the sleek kitchen, eggs on a pan, the news murmuring from a wall-mounted TV like this was any other weekday. Underneath, there was tension in the air, a humming awareness that the next steps carried weight none of us could ignore. Noah came out of his room, rubbing his eyes, hair sticking up in every direction. He took in the sight of Adrian at the stove with a spatula in hand, like some twisted version of a sitcom morning. His expression said he knew this was not normal, but he had decided not to fight the free breakfast. I watched them move around each other, my little brother and the man whose name made grown business owners lower their voices. It was such a bizarre pairing that part of my brain wanted to laugh, but the part that remembered the texts and the photo of our building kept my throat tight. Noah peppered me with questions in that sideways way he had, asking what was going to happen next, whether we were going home, and whether school was still a thing today. I did not know how to answer. Not honestly. So I told him the only true thing I had, that I had to go talk to detectives about what happened at the restaurant, and that after that, we would figure out our next moves. I kept my tone light and stable, even as my stomach twisted around the possibility that my next moves might include a new identity in some nowhere town or a target painted between my shoulder blades. Adrian had already set things in motion while the sky was still dark. He had someone on retainer, a lawyer he spoke about with the kind of respect he rarely showed anyone. By 9 in the morning, a man named Daniel Keene was sitting at the penthouse kitchen island, silver hair neatly combed, suit so sharp it looked like it had opinions. Daniel took me in with a look that managed to be both professional and strangely kind. He spoke to me like I was the most important person in the room, not just a civilian snared in someone else's war. He laid out the basics in calm, measured sentences, my rights, what the police could and could not demand, what to do if fear or guilt made me want to tell them more than was smart. He talked about Detective Harper, the one leading the case tied to Adrian. He described her as smart, relentless, and very good at making people feel like she was on their side, even when her entire job was to build cases against men like him. He warned me that she would likely come in wearing concern like a soft sweater, that she would offer coffee and sympathy and words like help and protection. Hearing all of that made a kind of dizzy logic click into place. I realized that I was not just walking into an interview. I was walking into a tug-of-war over my future. On one side was the law, with its complicated mix of justice and politics. On the other was Adrian, with his power and his particular brand of twisted safety. Daniel told me something that stuck. He said that fear can make people talk too much in those rooms, and that once words are recorded, they cannot be pulled back into your mouth. He reminded me that I did not owe anyone more than the facts of my own survival, that I was not responsible for solving the entire case or fixing the city. On the drive to the precinct, my nerves felt like exposed wires. The SUV's interior was quiet, just the low hum of the engine, and the faint city noise filtered through the glass. Adrian sat across from me, his presence a steady weight, not saying much, but watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I kept asking myself what I actually wanted. Did I want to see him in handcuffs? Pay for whatever crimes had brought him to the point where someone hired a sniper to take him out over dinner? Did I want to help the police pull at the threads of his empire until it unraveled, even if that meant the people who wanted him gone would still be out there, angry and unburdened of a shared enemy? What I wanted most, under all of it, was simple. I wanted Noah safe, boringly, predictably safe. The kind of safe where his biggest problem was a failing grade or a crush who did not like him back. Whatever path could get us closest to that felt like the right one, even if it meant choosing between two options that both made me a little sick. The precinct itself was exactly what you would expect if you had ever watched a crime show. Fluorescent lights washed everything in a tired yellow, the smell of burnt coffee and paperwork hanging in the air. Cops moved through the space in varying stages of alertness, some energized, some dragging, phones ringing, voices overlapping. Detective Harper met us in the hallway. She was in her late 30s, maybe, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot, eyes sharp enough to peel back layers. She shook my hand like she genuinely cared that I was there, her gaze flicking briefly to Adrian before landing back on me with an expression that said she had already decided he was the problem and I was the potential solution. She thanked me for coming, said she knew I had been through something traumatic, that she wanted to make this as easy as possible. Her voice had that practiced softness of someone who has delivered bad news to families and coaxed confessions out of frightened witnesses. If I had not been warned, I might have found myself relaxing into it. The interview room was smaller than I expected. A metal table, 4 chairs, a mirrored wall that everyone knew was not really a mirror, a camera in the corner with a little red light that never blinked. I sat on the side of the table facing the door, so I would not feel trapped, small rebellions still mattering even in big moments. Daniel sat beside me, legal pad in front of him, pen poised. Adrian was allowed in the room but stood off to the side, leaning against the wall, expression carefully neutral. Harper set a small recorder on the table, pressed a button, and the little red light on it joined the one in the corner. She started with the basics: my name, age, occupation, how long I had worked at the restaurant, and what my shift had been that night. Her questions were gentle at first, almost casual, like conversation more than interrogation. I told her about clocking in, about section assignments, about the usual Friday night crush of customers, and the way the kitchen always fell slightly behind between 19 and 21. I described Skyline 41 inches broad strokes, the layout, the window tables, the bar, and the path between the dining room and the kitchen swing doors. She nodded along, asking clarifying questions that made it clear she knew the floor plan already. Then she narrowed the focus to the moment of the shooting. She wanted to know exactly where I had been when the glass shattered, what I saw, what I felt. She asked me to walk her through it slowly, even when I stumbled or glossed over details. I kept my story as close to the simple truth as I could, without handing her anything that would put an easy line between me and Adrian and me. I said I had been standing near the table, clearing plates and checking in, when something in the window caught my eye, a flash that felt wrong. I described a sense of sudden danger, how my body moved before my brain had time to label it, how I had thrown myself sideways without really understanding why until the glass exploded. It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either. I did not mention the bathroom stall, the overheard phone call, or the folded note with my bad handwriting on it. I did not talk about counting men near the bar in the kitchen, about matching their positions to the words I had heard from behind a metal door. Harper listened, but I could see the skepticism settle in her eyes. She probed gently, asking if I often reacted to flashes in windows by tackling customers, whether I had military training, and whether anyone had warned me that something might happen that night. Her tone never got sharp, but there was steel under it. She mentioned other witnesses, how some of them had noticed me hovering near Adrian's table more than usual, how a few had seen him say something to me right before the shot. She asked if he had told me anything, if I had seen anyone or anything suspicious before. There was a moment when my throat tried to close. This was the crossroads Daniel had warned me about, the point where fear and guilt and the desire to be seen as honest could push me into saying too much. I felt his hand tap the underside of the table near my knee, a subtle reminder. I said that yes, of course, it looked unusual. Anytime a bullet flies through a window and someone survives by inches, people are going to start rewriting the story in their heads to make sense of it. I told her that my instincts had kicked in, that sometimes those instincts look a lot like luck. She did not buy it, not fully, but she also knew she could not prove otherwise. That is when she shifted tactics. The questions changed from what happened to what came next. She asked where I had gone after the shooting, who had taken me out through the service exit, and who had driven me away. She did not say Adrian abducted me, but the implication hung there, thick and heavy. She framed it as concern, suggesting that maybe I had been coerced or manipulated into staying with him. She talked about the text messages I had received, the threats. Of course they had copies. There is no such thing as a private digital panic when people like this are involved. She said she understood how frightening that must have been, that it made sense for me to seek protection. Then she slid the offer onto the table. Not literally, but through words that dropped between us like a contract. Witness protection, a new name, a different city, assistance in starting over somewhere far away from Chicago, far away from this entire mess. She painted it as a lifeline, a way to step out of the crossfire, to keep Noah safe, to reclaim some semblance of a normal life. She promised they would take the threats seriously, that the system could shield us if I let it. The catch, of course, was implicit. In exchange, She needed more than just my description of shattered glass and instinctive lunges. She wanted what I knew, what I had seen and heard that night, and maybe before. She wanted the note I had written that never made it into any official record. She never said, "Help us bring him down," but that hung under every protective word. If I cooperated fully, if I agreed to testify, if I gave them the narrative thread they needed to tie me to him in a way that would hold up in court, they would wrap me in a new life and call it safety. All I had to do was trade one kind of danger for another. It would have been easy to say yes in that moment, to tell myself that the law was on the right side, that Adrian was a criminal, that putting him away would balance some unseen moral ledger, to convince myself that any discomfort with that idea was just guilt taught by a broken system that favors the powerful. But here is the truth I could not get away from. Removing him would not magically erase the people who wanted him dead. It would not dissolve the organizations that had hired the sniper, or undo the fact that someone had taken a photo of my building and texted me about my brother. If I traded Adrian's protection for the badge, I would still be a target. I would just have fewer people willing to step between me and the gun. I thought about Noah, about how he had looked around the penthouse with that mix of suspicion and wonder, about how he had quietly admitted to me that being scared was not new, that growing up with constant financial instability had already wired his nerves in a certain way. Witness protection might give him a different kind of school and a different kind of apartment, but it would also give him a life spent looking over his shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up. I thought about Adrian too, whether I wanted to or not, about the way he had thrown himself over me when the glass exploded, the way his hand had held my wrist just tightly enough to keep me grounded, about the cold rage in his eyes when he read the threats on my phone, the way his voice went quiet when he talked about his father on that balcony at 3. Standing on the outside, he was easy to hate, easy to label as the problem. On the inside, things got messier. There was still blood on his hands, still decisions he had made that I could not excuse, but there was also the undeniable fact that he had kept me alive when doing nothing would have been easier. So when Harper finished her gentle pitch, when she slid her card across the table and told me I did not have to answer now, that I could think about it and call her, I took a breath and chose. I told her I appreciated the offer, that I believed she meant it when she said she wanted to help, but I also told her that right now, the only person who had actually stepped up between me, the people sending threats, and me, was Adrian, and that I was not ready to trade that for promises and paperwork. Her disappointment was subtle but unmistakable. She did not get angry. Good detectives rarely do that in front of a recorder. She just nodded slowly, said she could not force me to accept protection, and reminded me that her number would stay the same if I changed my mind. Walking out of that room, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter, because a choice that had been looming over me all night was finally made, at least for now. Heavier, because I knew that by choosing him, I was also choosing his world, with all its shadows and complications. On the drive back to Lakefront Tower, I could not meet his eyes at first. I stared out the window instead, watching the city blur by, wondering what version of me existed in the timelines where I had said yes to Harper. Would she be safer, or just lonely in some rented house in a state she could not spell, glancing out windows every time a car slowed down outside? When I finally looked across the SUV, I found Adrian watching me in that same steady way. He did not thank me, did not say I had done the right thing, did not pretend this was some romantic show of loyalty. He just acknowledged, with a small nod, that I had made a choice with my eyes open. That, more than anything, was what settled inside me as the car climbed back up to the glass and stone of his building. I was not sleepwalking through this anymore, not just being dragged along by circumstance. For better or worse, I had stepped into his world on my own 2 feet, and the next twist in this story was going to be one I had actively helped create. You would think walking out of an interview room where you just declined witness protection would be the peak insanity of the week. Turns out, that was just another step on the staircase. We were halfway back to Lakefront Tower when Adrian's phone buzzed with the kind of intensity that meant it was not just another update. He read the message, and I watched that now familiar shift in his posture, the way everything in him seemed to sharpen. He told Marco to change direction, and without asking, The car peeled off toward the lake, toward the part of the city where skyline photos never bothered to linger. The warehouse sat near the old docks, one of those long, low buildings that smelled like rust, oil, and old secrets. I had taken buses past places like it my whole life without ever expecting to see inside. Now I was walking into one with my heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs had turned into a drum. The air inside was colder than outside, the concrete floor holding on to the night. Light spilled down in harsh cones from fixtures high above, leaving corners in shadow. In the center of the space, under the brightest of those lights, sat a metal chair with a man tied to it. It took me a moment to recognize him. Without the expensive suit and hotel lighting, he looked smaller, older, the edges of his power worn thin. The salt and pepper hair was the same, the heavy jaw, the eyes that had looked at me in the hotel suite like I was an amusing moral problem. Victor Arlov. The name had been a rumor in neighborhood bars for months, attached to stories about new faces on the docks, shipments going missing, quiet pressure on small businesses. Now he was just a man with his wrists bound, blinking under a light that did not care how much his watch cost. I had never been in a place like that before. Every instinct screamed that I should not be there now, that rooms with men tied to chairs were the kind you only saw from a safe distance, preferably on a screen. But I had already sat in the interview room, already told a detective I was choosing Adrian's protection. Pretending I wanted clean hands at this point would have been a lie. Adrian did not swagger or gloat. He crossed the concrete with the same controlled stride I had seen in the restaurant, in the hotel suite, in his own living room at 3 a.m. He carried a slim folder instead of a weapon, which somehow felt more dangerous. The conversation that followed was not for me, not really. It was numbers and dates and wire transfers, names of shell companies and offshore accounts I had never heard of. Marco had done his work well. Every time Victor tried to deny something, another piece of paper under that single clip said otherwise. I understood enough to follow the shape of it. They had found the money trail behind the hit at Skyline 41, rooted through enough layers to confuse casual investigators but not enough to hide from people who lived in the same dirty river. They had dug into Victor's own organization too, tracing skimmed funds, hidden stashes, all the little ways a man like him tries to secure his own parachute. Adrian did not shout or threaten to break anyone's bones. He did something worse. He offered arithmetic. He laid out exactly what would happen if those records landed on the right desks. Federal, local, international. He sketched out a future where Victor would not just be facing charges. He would be facing betrayal from his own people, the ones who would not appreciate learning just how much he had tucked away for himself. He gave him 2 options, simple enough that even a girl who had never taken an accounting course could understand. Option 1. Every contract between Noah and me was pulled, immediately and completely, and a very clear message went out through the same channels that we were off limits. Option 2. Adrian walked away from that chair, handed the folder to the people best positioned to make Victor's life a slow-motion disaster, and let the pieces fall. I watched Victor weigh it. Watched pride war with self-preservation behind his eyes. For a second, I thought he might choose stubbornness, that he would cling to the idea of not bowing to a rival even if it meant losing everything. Then I saw the moment that older, deeper instinct kicked in. The one that makes humans grab for survival even when it tastes like humiliation. He agreed. Not gracefully, not politely, but clearly enough that even my untrained ear could hear the shape of surrender. Adrian made him confirm it more than once. Made him say my name, Noah's. Made him acknowledge that any move against us from that network would be treated as if it came from him personally. It should have made me feel safer. Watching the man who had treated my life like a chess move forced to fold his hand. Part of me did feel that, a loosening in my chest, like someone had loosened a too tight strap. Another part was busy trying not to throw up from the realization that I was now the kind of person whose safety depended on deals struck in warehouses. As we walked back toward the car, the cold air biting at my face, I asked Adrian quietly what would happen to Victor now. He said that was not my concern, which I understood was code for nothing good, even if it did not come from his hand directly. I am not naive enough to believe that men who get tied to chairs in warehouses go on to have peaceful retirements. The strangest part was how, after that, the world did not end. We left the warehouse. The door rolled down behind us. The city carried on. Traffic moved. Coffee shops opened. People in gym clothes jogged past without any idea that somewhere on the docks, a man had just traded his future for my continued breathing. Life, or something like it, resumed. Noah started at a new school the following week, the kind that did not have metal detectors at the entrance, and where the biggest scandal was a senior prank involving biodegradable glitter. I got a new job at a small bookstore in the West Loop, one of those places with crooked shelves and handwritten recommendation cards. Adrian did not try to lock me in the penthouse. He had rules, of course. I texted when I left for work, when I got there, when I headed home, and when I wanted to do something outside the usual routine. At first, it felt suffocating, then weirdly like a safety net I had never had before. Detective Harper called 2 weeks later. I had just finished stacking a new shipment of paperbacks when my phone buzzed with an unknown number that made my stomach flip. Her voice on the other end was steady, a little tired, but not unkind. She told me they had made arrests off the back of the footage from the restaurant and some anonymous tips they were still sorting through. She said certain names I recognized from the warehouse, from news stories, from the whispered gossip of the city. She did not say Victor's name directly, but it did not take a genius to connect the dots. She also told me something I had not been expecting, that the immediate threat against me and Noah was considered neutralized. The combination of internal power struggles in Victor's network and external pressure from law enforcement had shifted the landscape enough that, for now, we had fallen off their priority list. It was a distant kind of safety, but it was something. Then she said the thing that stuck with me the most. She told me I could go back to my life now, if I wanted, that I did not have to keep orbiting around Adrian, that I could step off this particular merry-go-round and try to build something normal again. I hung up and stood outside the bookstore for a long time, watching people move along the sidewalk, office workers clutching coffee, students with backpacks, a woman juggling a stroller and a conference call. All of them were living lives that had no idea how close mine had come to ending on a restaurant floor. The idea of just leaving had a certain pull. Find a new apartment, one that did not come with keycards and cameras, live on my own schedule again, rebuild some version of the quiet life I had before. No more black SUVs, no more security briefings disguised as casual conversations, no more men with earpieces pretending to be part of the furniture. But then I pictured that before life, honestly. The nights staring at overdue notices, the constant math in my head about which bill could be late without getting something shut off, the knot in my stomach every time Noah walked home alone, the way exhaustion had become a permanent state, not a passing condition. I walked the 20 blocks back to Lakefront Tower instead of taking the train. The city looked different when you knew where both the polished and the rotten parts were. By the time I stepped into the private elevator, my decision had already crystallized, even if I had not yet found the courage to say it out loud. Adrian was on the balcony when I got in, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, wind tugging at his hair as he looked out over the lake. Sometimes he looked like he was counting boats, other times like he was counting enemies. It was hard to tell. That night, he looked simply tired, the kind of tired that sits in your bones. I joined him, leaning my forearms on the railing, watching the water catch the fading light. I told him about Harper's call, about her saying the threat was neutralized, about the implied offer wrapped inside that sentence. I admitted that part of me had thought about leaving, about taking Noah and disappearing into a version of life where the word crew only meant sports teams. I also told him that I was not going to take it, not in the simple, clean way the detective probably imagined. Leaving and pretending the last weeks had never happened felt more dishonest than staying. But staying did not mean surrender. So I laid out my terms, because if there was one thing this whole mess had taught me, it was that I had been living my life as if I owed everyone everything and myself nothing. This time, if I was going to attach my life to a man like him, it was not going to be as a silent accessory. I told him I wanted to keep my job at the bookstore, that earning my own money was not negotiable. I told him that wherever we lived, whether it was this glass box or somewhere else down the line, I would pay into it, even if my contribution was pennies next to his. I needed to know that if everything went sideways, I still remembered how to stand on my own feet. I told him that every decision about Noah's future had to include me as an equal, not as a grateful bystander. School choices, activities, cities, all of it. If he wanted to help, and he had, arranging tutors and programs and things I had not even known how to ask for, he would do it with my input, not over my head. And finally, I told him that if there came a point where this life, his life, became something I could not live with anymore, either because of danger or because of the way it changed me, he would have to let me go. No strings, no pressure, no subtle threats disguised as concern. If I walked, he would not send shadows after me to tug me back. Saying all of that out loud felt like stepping off a ledge. This was a man used to people adjusting their orbits around him, not the other way around. Part of me braced for anger, for laughter, for a gentle reminder of how the power dynamic between us really worked. Instead, he listened, really listened, the way he had at 3 a.m. when I talked about my mother and the too thin walls of our old apartment. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, city noise filling the space between us. Then he said